Okay, so think about those times you're scrolling through social media and you see some crazy headline, right? And you instantly react. You're like outraged. Or maybe you're like, yeah, I knew it. And you share it with all your friends. And then like 2 hours later, you find out it was totally fake news.
Happens all the time.
It's like our brains are wired to just jump to conclusions.
That's exactly what we're going to be diving into today.
So that's where Daniel Kahneman's book comes in, Thinking Fast and Slow.
This is a really dense book.
Yeah, I mean, the guy won a Nobel Prize for this stuff, so, it's got to be serious.
He did, and it's packed with insights about how our minds work, which is fascinating in itself, but more importantly, how those insights can help us make better decisions.
So it's not just a theory book. It's actually got some actionable stuff in there.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. The whole point is to make us better thinkers.
Okay, I like that. So where do we even begin with this?
Well, Kahneman starts with this idea that we actually have two systems operating in our brains, System 1 and System 2.
Okay, two systems in our brains. Is he saying we're like double agents or something?
Not quite, haha, but it can feel that way sometimes. System 1, that's your fast, automatic, intuitive thinking. That's the one that's always on. It's like your quick draw response.
Okay, got it.
And then you've got System 2, the slower, more deliberate, analytical one.
So that's the one that we engage when we're like really focusing on something difficult.
Exactly, like when you're trying to solve a complex math problem or maybe learning a new language.
Or trying to parallel park in a tight space.
That's a good one. So System 1 is like the sprinter.
And System 2 is the marathon runner.
Perfect analogy.
So which system is in charge more often?
Well, most of our thoughts and actions are actually driven by System 1.
So we're on autopilot most of the time.
Pretty much, it's efficient, but it also makes us prone to all sorts of biases and errors because it relies on these mental shortcuts.
Uh-huh. So those snap judgments we talked about earlier, like reacting to that fake news headline, that System 1 in action.
Exactly. And here's where it gets really interesting because System 2 actually takes effort to engage. It requires attention. It gets tired easily.
It's like a muscle that gets sore if you overuse it.
Yeah. And so what often happens is System 2 just accepts whatever System 1 throws at it.
Oh, so it's kind of lazy.
In a way, yes. It's all about conserving energy.
So we're running on these mental shortcuts most of the time without even realizing it.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to be aware of these two systems. Knowing how they work can help us start to recognize when System 1 is leading us astray and when we need to engage System 2 to make more deliberate choices.
Okay, this is starting to make sense, but how do we actually do that? How do we engage System 2 when it seems like it's always taking a nap?
It does take effort, but like you said, it's like a muscle. The more you use it, the stronger it gets.
So how do we exercise our System 2?
One way is to simply slow down when you feel yourself reacting impulsively to something. Just take a pause. Ask yourself, what information am I missing here? Am I jumping to conclusions?
So it's about being more mindful and questioning those automatic thoughts.
Exactly. Another thing you can do is actively seek out information that challenges your initial assumptions. Don't just rely on what pops into your head first.
So basically become a skeptic.
Yeah, in a way, it's about being more critical of the information that's coming at us all the time, especially online.
Okay, that makes sense. So we've got these two systems, the fast one and the slow one working together, or maybe sometimes against each other. Kahneman uses this interesting term, the associative machine, to describe System 1. What does that mean?
It means that System 1 is constantly connecting ideas and concepts based on our experiences and memories. It's weaving narratives even when we don't realize it.
So our brains are like little storytellers.
Pretty much. And those stories aren't always accurate.
Okay, so for example,
Think about the word banana. What comes to mind?
yellow fruit monkeys.
Right. And you didn't have to think about it too hard. Those associations just popped into your head.
That's System 1 doing its thing.
Exactly. It's creating those links without us even being aware of it.
Fascinating. And this leads to something Kahneman calls cognitive ease.
Yes, cognitive ease is that feeling that something is familiar, true good, it just feels right. It's comfortable.
And that's not always a good thing, is it?
Not necessarily, because it can make us vulnerable to believing things that are actually false or misleading.
So things that feel easy to process might not actually be true.
Exactly. We need to be careful about that, especially in a world where information is designed to grab our attention and make us feel good.
So we should be wary of things that feel too easy, especially online.
Absolutely, because those things are often designed to manipulate us.
Okay, so we've got System 1, the associative machine that's always looking for those easy connections. And then we've got System 2, the lazy controller that we need to actively engage to avoid those mental traps.
Exactly, and one of the biggest traps that System 1 sets for us is something Kahneman calls WYSIAD.
WYSIAD. That sounds like some kind of exotic bird.
It stands for what you see is all there is.
Okay, that makes a little more sense.
It's this tendency to focus only on the information that's readily available and ignore what's missing.
So we're essentially filling in the blanks with our own assumptions.
Exactly. And those assumptions are often wrong, leading us to misjudge situations and make bad decisions.
Could you give us an example of this?
Sure, imagine you see a social media post from someone who looks incredibly happy and successful. You might automatically assume that their life is perfect.
Yeah, we all know that's not always the case.
Right, but that's WYSIety in action. We're only seeing the carefully curated version of their life, not the whole picture.
It's like judging a book by its cover.
Exactly, and this bias affects how we perceive the world, how we make decisions, how we interact with others.
So it's important to be aware of this tendency to overemphasize what's in front of us and actively seek out more information.
Absolutely. Challenge those assumptions. Look for missing information. Consider alternative perspectives. It takes effort, but it can help us make much more accurate judgments.
So it's about being more deliberate in our thinking.
Precisely. It's about engaging that lazy controller system too.
Okay, so far we've talked about system one, the associative machine, which is fast, intuitive, and often jumps to conclusions, and system two, the lazy controller, which we need to engage to avoid those mental traps.
And we've talked about how System 1 relies on cognitive ease, that feeling of familiarity and comfort that can lead us astray, and how WYSIety makes us focus on the readily available information, even if it's incomplete.
That's a lot to process.
It is, but it's just the tip of the iceberg.
Well, then I guess we better keep diving deeper into thinking fast and slow.
Welcome back to our deep dive into Daniel Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow.
Last time we talked about those two systems of thinking in our brains, right?
Okay.
System one, that's the fast, intuitive one, and system two, the slower, more deliberate one.
Right, and how System 1, while super efficient, can also lead to some predictable errors in judgment.
Like that time I booked a vacation based on a gorgeous beach photo online, only to find out the hotel was right next to a construction site.
Oof, yeah. That's System 1, prioritizing speed over careful consideration. It's all about making those quick judgments with limited info.
So this time around, are we going to explore even more of these biases so we can, recognize them in ourselves and others?
Exactly, because once we understand these biases, we can start to develop strategies to mitigate their influence and hopefully make more rational decisions.
Okay, so where do we even begin? What are some of the most common biases that trip us up?
Let's talk about anchoring. This is a classic cognitive bias where our judgments are swayed by an initial piece of information, even if it's totally irrelevant.
Okay, can you give me an example? I'm so lost.
Imagine you're trying to negotiate the price of a used car, right?
Okay.
And the seller starts by throwing out a ridiculously high number.
I see where you're going with this.
Even though you know it's way too much, that initial anchor, it's probably going to influence your counteroffer.
So even if I know it's a crazy price, my brain kind of latches onto that first number and adjusts from there.
Exactly. It sets this mental benchmark that's hard to shake off. You probably end up offering more than you would have if they'd started with a reasonable price.
Wow, it's like that first number sets the stage, even if it's completely arbitrary.
Exactly. And it's not just about numbers either. Anchoring can happen with all sorts of information.
Really, like what?
Like if you read a negative review of a movie before seeing it, that first impression, it might color your whole experience, even if the movie wasn't actually that bad.
So that first impression, whether it's a number or an opinion, can really skew our perception.
Absolutely. So how do we avoid falling for the anchoring effect?
Yeah, what's the antidote to this anchoring bias?
Well, awareness is key. When you're making a decision, especially a big one, just try to be conscious of any anchors that might be influencing your thinking.
So do your own research, seek out different perspectives. Don't just take things at face value.
Exactly. Be skeptical. They'll challenge those initial impressions.
Okay, makes sense. Now, what about other biases? What else should we watch out for?
Another common one is the availability heuristic.
The availability what now?
Heuristic, it's a fancy word, but it basically means we tend to overestimate the likelihood of events that are easy to recall or that are vivid in our minds.
Okay, so if we've recently seen a news report about a plane crash, we might suddenly think plane crashes are way more common than they actually are.
Exactly. Or if a friend tells us about a bad experience they had with a certain brand, we might be more likely to avoid that brand, even if it's statistically a rare occurrence.
It's like our brains are saying, hey, if it's easy to remember, it must be important.
Yeah. But that's not always the case. Our memories are biased towards the dramatic and the emotional, and of course the media plays a role too. Those sensational stories, they get more attention, which can really distort our view of reality.
So it's a combination of our own memories and the information we're bombarded with. It's like a double whammy of bias.
You could say that.
So how do we combat this availability bias?
Well, when you're assessing risk or making a decision, try to step back and consider the bigger picture. Don't just rely on the first few examples that pop into your head.
So do some research, look at statistics, get a more balanced view.
Exactly.
Okay, so it's about being more critical of the information that's readily available, especially the stuff that's designed to grab our attention.
Exactly. And that brings us to another closely related bias, the representativeness heuristic.
Okay, I'm sensing a pattern here. A lot of these biases have to do with mental shortcuts, right?
Our brains are wired for efficiency, but sometimes those shortcuts lead us astray.
And in this case.
So with the representativeness heuristic, we tend to judge the probability of something belonging to a certain category based on how closely it resembles a stereotype or prototype we have in our minds.
Okay, I need an example.
Okay, so imagine you meet someone who's very quiet, shy, and loves to read.
Sounds like a librarian.
Right. You might jump to that conclusion, but statistically, there are way more salespeople or teachers in the world than librarians.
So we're letting stereotypes guide our judgments instead of looking at the actual probabilities.
Exactly. We're overemphasizing the similarity to a stereotype and ignoring those base rates.
This all comes back to being aware of those mental shortcuts our brains are taking right and not blindly trusting our first impressions.
Precisely. And that's a key theme throughout Kahneman's work. We need to be aware of the limitations of our intuitive thinking and, learn to engage our more deliberate analytical minds when it really matters.
Okay, that makes sense. So what's another bias we should be on the lookout for?
Let's talk about loss aversion. This one's particularly powerful because it taps into our emotions.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
Essentially, it means we feel the pain of a loss much more strongly than we feel the pleasure of an equivalent gain.
So losing $100 feels way worse than gaining $100 feels good.
Exactly. And this asymmetry, it has a huge impact on our decisions.
How so?
We're often more motivated to avoid losses than to pursue gains, even if, logically, the potential gains outweigh the potential losses.
I can definitely relate to that, Matt. I tend to dwell on my mistakes way more than I celebrate my successes.
That's very common, and it highlights how loss aversion can sometimes hold us back from taking risks or pursuing opportunities.
So how do we overcome this tendency to focus on the negative?
One strategy is to reframe your thinking. Instead of focusing on what you might lose, try to focus on what you might gain.
So like if I'm considering a career change, don't dwell on the potential salary cut. Think about the increased job satisfaction and the new skills I could learn.
Exactly. It's about shifting our perspective from a place of fear to a place of possibility.
I like that another helpful tip is to actually quantify those potential gains and losses. Write them down, compare them side by side.
Yeah.
Force yourself to think about the numbers, not just the emotions.
Precisely. We're bringing in that rational system, too, to balance out the emotional impulses of system one.
Okay, so it's all about finding that balance.
Now let's shift gears a bit and talk about the framing effect. This is another incredibly powerful bias that shows how the way information is presented can drastically influence our choices, even if the underlying facts are the same.
Okay, this sounds like something marketers and politicians use all the time.
Oh, you're absolutely right. They're masters of framing.
Give me an example.
Okay, imagine you're told that a medical procedure has a 90% survival rate.
Okay.
That sounds pretty good, right? You'd feel optimistic about those odds.
Yeah, be like, sign me up.
Now imagine you're told that the same procedure has a 10% mortality rate.
Ooh, that suddenly feels a lot riskier.
Right, even
Yeah.
though the information is identical.
Wow. It's the same data, just framed in a different way, but it triggers a completely different emotional response. It's amazing how easily our brains can be manipulated.
It is, and that's why it's so important to be aware of framing effects.
So when we're presented with information, especially statistics, we really need to pay attention to how it's being framed.
Exactly. Try to reframe it in different ways to see if it changes your perception.
Yeah.
Don't let someone else's framing dictate your decisions.
Okay, so we need to become expert frame detectors.
Precisely. Now let's move on to another related bias, the sunk cost fallacy.
Oh, I've heard of this one, isn't it? About clinging to things we've already invested in, even if it's no longer rational.
The sunk cost fallacy is that tendency to continue investing in something, time, money, effort, simply because we've already sunk so much into it.
Even if it's clearly a lost cause.
Exactly. It's like that old saying, throwing good money after bad.
And we do it all the time, don't we? Like staying in a dead-end relationship because we've already invested so many years, or pouring money into a failing business venture because we can't admit defeat.
Exactly. It's like we're trying to justify those past investments, even if it means digging ourselves deeper into a hole.
But sometimes the best decision is to just cut our losses and move on, right?
Absolutely. Recognizing the sunk cost fallacy can be incredibly liberating. It allows us to make decisions based on what's best for the future, not what's happened in the past.
So how do we escape the clutches of this sunk cost fallacy?
One helpful strategy is to think about it from an outsider's perspective. Imagine you're advising a friend in the same situation. What would you tell them to do?
That's a good point. Sometimes we need that outside perspective to see things more clearly.
Exactly. Now, let's move on to a bias that's particularly relevant in today's world of, social media and constant connectivity.
Okay, I'm all ears. What is it?
It's called the illusion of validity.
Okay, the illusion of validity, break that down for me.
It's this belief that our judgments and predictions are accurate even when we have evidence to the contrary.
So we basically think we know more than we actually do.
In a way, yes, and this illusion is often fueled by the stories we create in our minds. We connect the dots, we find patterns, and we tend to ignore information that doesn't fit our narrative.
It's like we're writing our own versions of reality. We're the heroes of our own stories. But how do we make sure those stories are actually based on facts and not just wishful thinking?
That's the challenge, and social media can actually amplify this effect. Because we tend to surround ourselves with people who share our views, which reinforces that sense of being right, even if our views are based on flawed information.
It's like we're trapped in these echo chambers of confirmation bias.
Precisely. Now, the good news is that understanding the illusion of validity can help us become more humble and more open-minded.
Okay, so how do we break free from this illusion?
One key is to actively seek out information that challenges our beliefs. Don't just read articles or follow people who reinforce what you already think.
So get out of our comfort zones and be willing to question everything, even our most cherished beliefs.
Exactly. And another strategy is to actually track your predictions. Write down your predictions about future events and then revisit them later to see how accurate you were.
So it's about becoming more data-driven in a way, tracking our own cognitive biases in action.
Precisely. Now let's talk about another fascinating concept, the planning fallacy.
Okay, I feel like we've touched on this before. Isn't this where we underestimate how long things will actually take?
You got to say, the planning fallacy is this almost comical tendency we have to underestimate the time, costs, and risks of future projects, and at the same time, we overestimate the benefits.
Oh yeah, we've all been there thinking we can knock out that home renovation in a month.
Yeah.
And it ends up taking 6, or launching that business with, minimal investment, and then the costs just spiral out of control.
Exactly. It's like we're wearing these rose-colored glasses when we're planning for the future.
Why do we do that?
I think it's partly because we want to believe that things will go smoothly and that we're in control.
Yeah, we tend to focus on the best case scenario, ignoring potential obstacles and delays.
Yeah.
And we often fail to account for the unexpected.
Exactly. Life is full of surprises, and those surprises almost always add time and complexity to our plans.
So it's a combination of optimism bias, a lack of realistic planning, and maybe a little bit of wishful thinking.
Precisely so. How do we overcome the planning fallacy? How do we become more realistic planners?
Yeah, how do we take off those rose-colored glasses and see our projects more clearly?
One strategy is to use what Kahneman calls the outside view. Instead of just focusing on your own project and your own unique circumstances, look at similar projects that have been completed in the past. How long did they actually take? What were the unexpected costs? What were the biggest challenges?
So using historical data to inform our predictions.
Exactly. Another helpful tip is to break down your project into smaller, more manageable tasks.
So we can get a more realistic sense of the time and effort involved.
Exactly. And finally, don't be afraid to add a buffer to your estimates. Things almost always take longer than we expect, so build in some extra time for those inevitable delays and unexpected hiccups.
It's like giving ourselves a little wiggle room for error.
Now, you mentioned earlier that the planning fallacy is particularly relevant in today's world. Why is that?
Well, I think it's because the pace of life is so fast these days. Everything is so demanding and complex. We're constantly bombarded with information deadlines, expectations.
Exactly. And that can make us even more susceptible to the planning fallacy because we're constantly trying to cram more into less time.
It's like we're living in a perpetual state of overcommitment.
Exactly, and that can lead to burnout stress and feeling constantly behind.
So it's more important than ever to be aware of the planning fallacy and to really try to manage our time and expectations more realistically.
Absolutely. Now let's talk about another bias that's closely related to the planning fallacy, the illusion of control.
Okay, I'm sensing a theme here. Are we humans just delusional optimists?
Well, we do have a tendency to see the world through a slightly rosier lens than reality might warrant.
But that doesn't mean we can't learn to be more realistic, right?
Exactly. So with the illusion of control, we tend to overestimate our ability to influence events that are largely beyond our control.
So, like, we think we have more power than we actually do.
Exactly. And this illusion can be especially strong when it comes to things like gambling, investing, or even our health.
Like, we think we can beat the odds or outsmart the market or even control our genes.
Precisely. And this illusion can lead us to take unnecessary risks, make poor decisions, and blame ourselves for outcomes that were largely outside of our control.
So how do we combat this illusion of control? How do we become more comfortable with uncertainty and embrace the randomness of life?
One key is to focus on what you can control. You can't control the outcome of a coin toss, but you can control how much you're willing to bet. You can't control the stock market, but you can control your investment strategy. And you can't control your genes, but you can control your lifestyle choices.
It's about focusing on the things we can influence and letting go of the things we can't.
Exactly. Now let's wrap up this section with a discussion of optimism bias.
Okay, this one sounds familiar. Isn't this about seeing the world through rose-colored glasses?
You're on the right track. Optimism bias is this tendency to overestimate the likelihood of positive events and underestimate the likelihood of negative events.
So we all think we're special snowflakes who are immune to misfortune.
In a way, yes, and this bias can be both beneficial and detrimental.
How so?
On the one hand, it can motivate us to pursue our goals and persevere. If we didn't believe that good things were possible, we might never try anything new or take any risks.
So it's like having this built-in cheerleader in our heads urging us to keep going.
Exactly. But on the other hand, optimism bias can also lead us to make poor decisions, take unnecessary risks, and fail to plan for potential setbacks.
It's a double-edged sword. It can fuel our dreams, but it can also blind us to reality.
Precisely so. How do we harness the power of optimism without falling prey to its pitfalls? How do we find that sweet spot between realistic planning and hopeful anticipation?
Yeah, that's the question.
Well, one key is to be aware of the bias. Recognize that your brain is naturally wired to be optimistic, and that's not necessarily a bad thing.
But we need to balance it out.
Exactly. Don't let that optimism blind you to potential risks or challenges.
So it's not about eliminating optimism altogether. We're just trying to temper it with a dose of reality.
Exactly. And another helpful strategy is to cultivate what's called realistic optimism.
Realistic optimism. Okay, I like that. What is that?
It's a type of optimism that's grounded in reality. It's about acknowledging the potential for setbacks, but believing that you have the skills and resources to overcome them.
So it's not about denying the possibility of negative events. It's about believing in our ability to cope with them.
Precisely. And that brings us to the end of our exploration of cognitive biases for this part of the deep dive.
Wow, that was a whirlwind tour of the human mind's quirks and foibles, anchoring availability, representativeness, loss, aversion framing, sunk costs, the illusion of validity, the planning fallacy, the illusion of control optimism bias.
It is a lot to process, but
Right.
the key takeaway here is awareness.
Right. The more we understand these biases, the better equipped we'll be to make more rational decisions.
Exactly, and navigate the world with greater clarity and confidence.
So it's like we're upgrading our mental operating systems, right? Patching those vulnerabilities and
Yeah.
installing some powerful new tools.
I like that analogy.
Now that we've uncovered all these biases, let's talk about what we can actually do about them. How can we use this knowledge to make better decisions in our everyday lives? Okay, welcome back.
It feels like we've just run a marathon through our own minds.
We have covered a lot of ground, haven't we, exploring this fascinating, sometimes frustrating world of cognitive biases.
Yeah, from anchoring to the illusion of control. It's amazing how many ways our brains can trick us into making, less than ideal decisions.
It's remarkable how predictable those patterns are. Kahneman's research shows that these biases, they're not limited to certain types of people or certain situations.
So they affect all of us.
They affect us all.
That's both reassuring and kind of alarming at the same time. So now that we've uncovered all these biases, let's talk about what we can actually do about them. How can we use this knowledge to make better decisions in our everyday lives?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And The good news is that Kahneman, he offers some really practical strategies for overcoming these biases and becoming better thinkers. Okay, give us the good stuff. What are some actionable steps we can take, like starting today?
One of the simplest yet most powerful tools is awareness. Just by understanding these biases and how they operate, we're already a step ahead.
So it's like knowing the enemy in battle.
Precisely, awareness is like having this mental radar system that can help us detect those cognitive distortions before they lead us astray.
Okay, so awareness is key, but what else can we do?
Another strategy is to slow down our system one. It loves to jump to conclusions, but system two, the more deliberate one, it needs time to process information and weigh different perspectives.
It's like hitting the pause button on our autopilot brains.
Exactly. So when you're facing a decision, especially a big one, don't rush to judgment, take a step back, gather more information, consider alternative viewpoints.
That's easier said than done, though, right when we're constantly bombarded with information and pressure to make quick decisions.
True. But even a few moments of reflection can make a big difference, and this is where another tool comes in checklists.
Checklists like the kind pilots use before takeoff.
Exactly. Checklists can be incredibly helpful for reducing errors and improving decision-making, especially in those high-stakes situations. They force us to slow down, systematically consider all the relevant factors, and avoid those impulsive System 1 shortcuts.
So it's like creating a structured process to guide our thinking,
That's a great analogy.
almost like a recipe for better decision making.
Think of it as a recipe for debiasing your mind.
Okay, I'm liking this idea of checklists. It seems very practical and actionable. What other tools does Kahneman suggest?
Another powerful approach is to think about thinking. He calls this metacognition.
Metacognition, it sounds kind of like a sci-fi movie.
It might sound fancy, but it's simply the ability to reflect on our own thinking processes. It's about becoming aware of our own biases, questioning our assumptions, and recognizing when we might be making errors in judgment.
So it's like having an internal observer who can monitor our thoughts and flag any potential problems.
Precisely, it's about developing that inner voice that asks, am I falling into a trap here? Is there another way to look at this situation?
And the more we practice metacognition, the better we get at catching those biases before they lead us down the wrong path.
Exactly. It's like training our brains to become more self-aware and to question our own assumptions.
Okay, so we've got awareness, slowing down, checklists, and metacognition, all very helpful strategies. But what about those situations where we're dealing with like really complex data or trying to make decisions that are just highly susceptible to our biases? What can we do then?
That's where algorithms can be incredibly useful.
Algorithms like the ones that power our social media feeds and online shopping recommendations.
Those are certainly examples of algorithms, but they're not always used for good. However, algorithms can also be a valuable tool for making more objective decisions, especially when we're dealing with a lot of data or trying to overcome our own inherent biases.
Can you give me an example of how algorithms can be used for better decision making?
Absolutely. Let's say you're a hiring manager and you're trying to choose between several candidates for a job. It's easy to let your personal biases influence your decision, even if you're not aware of them. An algorithm, on the other hand, can analyze the candidate's qualifications and experience objectively without those human biases.
So it's like taking the human element out of the equation, at least to some extent.
Precisely, and while algorithms aren't perfect, they can be a powerful tool for reducing errors and making more fair and impartial decisions. Think of them as a complement to our own judgment, not a replacement for it.
It's like using technology to enhance our own cognitive abilities.
Exactly. Now, another strategy that Kahneman recommends is to seek out diverse perspectives. We tend to surround ourselves with people who think like us, which can reinforce our own biases and blind us to alternative viewpoints.
It's that echo chamber effect we talked about earlier.
Exactly. So make a conscious effort to expose yourself to different perspectives, even if they make you uncomfortable. Read books and articles by authors with different viewpoints, talk to people from different backgrounds, and seek out information that challenges your own assumptions.
It's about expanding our horizons and getting out of our intellectual comfort zones. I know they can be challenging, especially in today's world, but it's so important to be open to different ways of thinking.
I completely agree, and this brings us to one of the most powerful antidotes to cognitive biases: humility.
Humility. How does that help us make better decisions?
Humility is the recognition that we don't know everything and that we're all prone to errors in judgment. It's the willingness to admit when we're wrong, to change our minds when presented with new evidence, and to learn from our mistakes.
So it's about embracing our own fallibility.
Exactly. The more humble we are, the less likely we are to fall prey to those cognitive biases that can lead us astray. Humility allows us to approach the world with curiosity and a willingness to learn rather than clinging to our own limited perspectives.
It's about recognizing that we all have blind spots and that we can learn from each other.
Precisely. And that brings us to the end of our deep dive into thinking fast and slow.
Wow, what a journey this has been. We've explored the inner workings of our minds, uncovered all those hidden biases, and discovered some practical strategies for improving our thinking.
I think the most important takeaway from this book is that we're not slaves to our cognitive biases. We can learn to recognize them, challenge them, and ultimately make more rational and informed decisions.
Absolutely, it's an ongoing process, but with awareness, effort, and a bit of humility, we can all become better thinkers,
And better decision makers.
which can lead to a more fulfilling and successful life. This has been a truly enlightening deep dive. Thank you for joining us on this exploration of the human mind. Until next time, keep thinking, keep learning, and keep questioning everything, even your own assumptions.